If there are free territories on the Earth, sooner or later mankind will try to divide them. In 1961, the Antarctic Treaty was concluded, which strictly prohibits the placement of military bases and mining on the continent. This document was signed and ratified by 50 countries, including the United States, Russia, and China. However, the treaty expires in 2048, and this could lead to a new debate on the division of Antarctica. If scientists' predictions about global warming come true, the continent's climate will resemble modern-day Norway by then, making it even more attractive for development. To date, 7 countries have already laid territorial claims to Antarctica. They have research stations on the continent, but they are placed chaotically, making it impossible to form clear national zones. Currently, more than 70 research stations belonging to 30 different states operate near the South Pole. The population of Antarctica varies depending on the season. In summer there are up to 4,000 people there, and in winter, about 1,000. If you look at the map of territorial claims, you can see that the boundaries of the alleged sectors diverge from the pole along the meridians. Of particular interest is the Antarctic Peninsula, which is simultaneously claimed by Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and Great Britain. Such interest is explained simply. It is the warmest region of Antarctica, and Chile and Argentina are located quite close, beyond the Drake Passage. However, despite all the territorial ambitions of different countries, the future of the continent in 2048 will largely depend on the position of 2 key states. Antarctica should not be divided by state borders, but should remain a continent symbolizing friendship and international cooperation. The existence of Antarctica was confirmed during the research expedition led by Thaddeus Bellingshausen and Mikhail Lazarev. In January 1820, they first recorded the existence of the 6th continent, the coldest and most inhospitable for humans. On July 16, 1819, the sloops Vostok and Mirny, prepared for a long voyage, left Kronstadt and set out on an expedition. The crew consisted of 190 people. Captain of the 2nd rank Thaddeus Bellingshausen was appointed the leader of the expedition, and Officer Mikhail Lazarev was appointed his deputy. Despite government funding, the expedition was predominantly scientific in nature. However, politics also played its role. From the first days of the expedition, scientific observations were made, which Bellingshausen and his crew carefully recorded in the logbook. All participants of the campaign were volunteers, distinguished by excellent health, experience, and literacy. Supplies were loaded for 2 years, but during the voyage they were regularly replenished in the ports on the route. One of the disadvantages of the training was the different characteristics of the ships. The Vostok was maneuverable and fast, but was inferior to the Mirny in strength. In stormy conditions and ice fields the crew had a hard time. At the same time, Mirny, originally rebuilt from icebreaker transport, had a stronger hull and better coped with navigation in ice, but was noticeably slower. The sailors embarked on a perilous voyage to unknown shores, with no idea of the difficulties they would face. They waded through the ice, endured bitter cold, freezing rain, and violent storms. There was no communication with their homeland, and the goal itself could only be a legend. Nevertheless, the expedition lost only 3 men during the 751-day voyage. During the campaign, the ships covered more than 92,000 kilometers. Forced at times to go to warmer waters in the north, they did not stop searching for a way to Antarctica. Waiting for favorable conditions, the expedition explored the islands of Polynesia and discovered 15 new islands. The official date of the discovery of Antarctica is January 28, 1820. On this day, the ships Mirny and Vostok approached the future Queen Maud Land. They crossed the South Polar Circle several times, following the continent. In early February, the expedition again approached the Antarctic coast in the area that would later be called the Princess Astrid Coast. However, severe weather conditions did not allow a detailed examination of the vicinity. When navigation off Antarctica became impossible in the spring, the ships took different routes to the port of Jackson, Sydney. In November, they made a second attempt to reach the mainland and during the expedition discovered the islands of Peter the Great, Shishkov, Mordvinov, and Alexander I Land. However, on January 30, 1821, a leak was discovered in the east, because of which the expedition had to be terminated. On July 24, the ships returned to Kronstadt. How can such a remote territory be controlled and protected? What benefits can it bring? For a long time, Antarctica remained outside the sphere of interests of states. Only some expeditions were sent there, but no one tried to formalize their rights to it. In addition, the discovery of Russian navigators was not disputed by anyone, until it became clear that Antarctica has valuable resources and is of interest to all mankind. Fearing that the continent could fall under the control of the USSR, the world powers hurried to take action. In 1959, an international treaty was signed, which came into force in 1961. According to this agreement, Antarctica does not belong to any state, and the placement of military facilities and the entry of warships is prohibited. In the 1980s, the mainland was also declared a nuclear-free zone. Today, 50 countries participate in the treaty, and dozens of others have observer status. About 50 scientific stations operate on the territory of Antarctica. But this is not all the amazing facts about Antarctica. For example, under a multi-kilometer layer of ice are subglacial lakes, which may have preserved life that evolved for millions of years in complete isolation from the rest of the world. More than 140 subglacial lakes have been discovered in Antarctica, but the most famous is Lake Vostok. The lake is hidden under a 4-kilometer layer of ice, but thanks to geothermal springs located under its bottom, the water in it does not freeze. The temperature of water at the depth of the lake reaches 10 degrees Celsius. According to scientists, the multi-kilometer ice sheet has played the role of a natural insulator, preserving unique living organisms that could have evolved in complete isolation for millions of years. However, exactly what life forms may inhabit Lake Vostok remains an open question. U.S. researchers drilled in the area in the 1990s, but did not reach the lake itself, and were only able to extract samples of ice formed from its water gradually rising up and freezing. Analysis of these samples by scientist Scott Rogers' team using metagenomic techniques revealed DNA from 1,623 different species. What was most surprising was that about 6% of the organisms found belonged to complex multicellular creatures, eukaryotes with a cellular nucleus. Moreover, among the sequences found was a bacterium that is believed to live exclusively in the intestines of fish and does not occur separately from them in nature. They also found genes characteristic of mollusks and rotifers, representatives of multicellular fauna, whose existence in such a harsh place was considered unlikely. Based on their research, American scientists have suggested that Lake Vostok may be home to quite complex organisms, including fish and crustaceans. According to one hypothesis, this body of water remained open for tens of millions of years, and only in the last 14 to 15 million years was hidden under the ice. This means that local life forms may have had enough time to adapt to the conditions of subglacial existence. Moreover, if there are indeed fish and other complex organisms in the lake, they could have reduced the extremes of the local environment. Oxygen-breathing creatures could consume the excess oxygen that comes with the ice. This, in turn, could have mitigated the conditions, as excess oxygen is a strong oxidizer, making it difficult for living organisms to survive. Researchers believe that it is possible to talk about subglacial life in Lake Vostok only if it is possible to find organisms whose genetic sequences are completely different from those known on Earth. Scientists have found in DNA samples of a bacterium that does not correspond to any known species. This bacterium is so unique that it was not even possible to classify it within existing groups. 14% of its genome is not found in any other known microorganism. As Sergei Bulat noted, if such DNA was found on Mars, it could be called an extraterrestrial form of life. However, despite its uniqueness, this bacterium remains a simple single-celled organism without a complex structure. Thus, the hypothesis that multicellular organisms, including eukaryotes, fish and crustaceans, exist in the lake has not yet been confirmed. Scientists believe that as long as nothing more complex than bacteria is found in the ice samples, it is premature to talk about the presence of a developed ecosystem in Lake Vostok. This may even be for the best. If Lake Vostok were really inhabited by fish living in total darkness and without nutrients from the surface, they would be so alien to everything we know that they might resemble the green men in the sci-fi stories of ufologists. In Antarctica, there is a mountain range comparable in size to the Alps. These are the Gamburtsev Mountains, named in honor of the Soviet geophysicist and academician whose expedition in 1958 discovered their existence. The mountain range stretches for 1,300 kilometers, its width varies from 200 to 500 kilometers, and its highest point reaches 3,390 meters. The most amazing thing is that this entire massif is hidden under a giant layer of ice. On average, the ice cover over the mountains is 600 meters thick, but in some places it reaches more than 4 kilometers. Antarctica is the only continent on Earth that is not divided into time zones. It simply does not have its own time. All scientists and expedition participants orient themselves either to the time of their home country or to the time of supply bases from where supplies come. Antarctica is home to the Weddell Sea, recognized as the most transparent sea on the planet. Its exceptional clarity is due to the fact that there are virtually no sources of pollution in the region. The water in the Weddell Sea is so transparent that it allows you to see objects at a depth of up to 79 meters, almost like distilled water. Some icebergs in Antarctica are so huge that their area is comparable to a whole city. And that's an understatement. Just imagine, the largest registered iceberg that broke away from Antarctic glaciers was 295 kilometers long and 37 kilometers wide. But even more mysterious are those icebergs, which researchers find strange, perfectly smooth edges. Their origin raises questions. It seems that such shapes could only appear due to artificial intervention. Many people imagine Antarctica as a vast icy desert. And this is indeed true, almost everywhere. However, there are areas on the continent where there is no snow and ice at all. For example, there are snowless valleys and even sand dunes. But do not be deceived, this is not because it is warmer there than in the rest of Antarctica. On the contrary, the conditions in these areas are even more severe. In the dry valleys of McMurdo blow incredibly powerful winds that reach 320 kilometers per hour. They literally dry out the terrain, causing evaporation of moisture, so there is no snow or ice. Such extreme conditions make these valleys look like Martian landscapes. That's why NASA used them for testing spacecraft landing modules. Modern scientists believe that the Antarctica ice sheet began to form 30 to 35 million years ago. Since then, this continent has remained the coldest, driest, and windiest place on Earth. Since then, Antarctica's ice sheet has reached a thickness of several kilometers in some places. However, there is one curious fact in the history of world cartography. Before the 16th century, cartographers knew quite well the outlines of the northern shores of Europe, modern Siberia, and even many islands in the Arctic Ocean. Moreover, they seemed to be familiar with the full contour of Antarctica, as if they had even landed there. But since the 17th century, the situation changed dramatically, as if everyone forgot about the existence of Antarctica. And the northern lands suddenly turned into a white spot on maps, becoming the territory of terra incognita. And so it went on until the 19th century. One of the examples of mysterious maps is the map of Pyre Reis, on which Antarctica is depicted without ice. That is, it was supposedly seen as such only 500 years ago. But the fact is that the map of Pyre Reis is not the only evidence in favor of this version. There's also a map by Orontius Phineas, dated 1531. On it Antarctica is depicted with high accuracy, and there is also Hyperborea, the legendary land at the North Pole. This means that in the 16th century there were representations of both Hyperborea and ice-free Antarctica. Supporters of the alternative point of view believe that the climate of the Earth before 16th century was completely different, much warmer, and the North Pole was located in the area of the west coast of Greenland. Medieval navigators freely reached the shores of Antarctica and the North Pole, because in those times these territories were practically not covered with ice and had a rather mild climate. However, in the 16th century there was a sharp shift of the poles to their present position, which led to the beginning of the Little Ice Age. It was then that Antarctica was quickly covered with a thick layer of ice. Interestingly, this theory is supported by the example of another island that is now hidden under a massive ice sheet, Greenland. Here is what the German traveler and geographer Adam Olearius wrote in his book Voyage of the Holstein about Greenland. As late as 1389, Greenland was practically ice and snow-free. Icelandic and Norwegian ships traveled to it freely, sailors landed unhindered and conducted trade. These words find confirmation in the writings of the Italian philosopher Giovanni Pontana of the late 15th century. He collected the stories of seafarers of his time and claimed that the voyage to the blooming paradise of Greenland was not difficult. Medieval sources speak of numerous convenient bays, well-established sea routes, dense forests and fertile fields. The climate was warm and ice was absent. Modern research also confirms that Greenland was densely populated in the early 15th century. On its territory lived Vikings, who built several large stone cities. For example, in the town of Gardar there were up to 100 stone houses. There were trading shops, blacksmiths, their own shipyard, a church, and also had their own bishop, which indicates a high level of organization of life. The last authentic mention of merchant ships returning from Greenland dates back to 1410. At that time, The island still lived up to its name, the Greenland, remaining green, prosperous and livable. However, as early as the 16th century, alarming reports began to come in from mariners passing by Greenland. They said that the giant ice had made its shores so impregnable that even landing on land was impossible. In 1586, Danish ships sent by order of the king could not approach the island. The way was blocked by massive ice hundreds of meters thick. It turns out that in just a few decades Greenland was under a powerful ice sheet. Today, the thickness of the Greenland ice sheet reaches more than 3 kilometers, almost as thick as the Antarctic ice sheet. But what raises questions for researchers? The Greenland ice sheet took just 50 years to form. Antarctic, according to the official version, for 30 to 35 million years. At the same time, there are historical evidences describing a sharp climate change at the beginning of the 16th century, associated with the onset of the Little Ice Age. The Melk Annals of the 15th and 16th centuries, chronicles compiled in a Benedictine monastery in the Austrian town of Melk on the Danube, describe a powerful natural disaster. 1502. In this year there was a severe flood that began on the eve of the Ascension of Mary and lasted almost 10 days. Water flooded towns and castles along the Danube, making them navigable. The torrent swept away houses, and 2 houses in Melk itself, along with their families, were swept far to the east. Meadows and gardens were covered with sand, trees uprooted, vineyards destroyed. Stables, barns, and all sorts of utensils floated downstream day and night. These descriptions confirm that in the early 16th century there were indeed global climatic changes, the effects of which were felt not only in Greenland but also in Europe. As a result, the Danube flooded the major cities and villages with such force that there were almost no surviving houses. Such devastating floods occurred from 1502 to 1508, lasting as long as 6 years. But even more frightening was the year 1525, when in the middle of summer a real ice age suddenly arrived. Vienna, 1525. In the middle of summer, a frost suddenly struck so hard that people who had not had time to hide in their homes froze to death in the streets. Birds, stiff from the cold, fell from the sky like stones. Life in towns and villages came to a standstill for months, and a great number of people died of hypothermia. In Europe, all wildlife virtually disappeared. The Danube was so frozen that people, riders, wagons and loaded carts could move freely on its ice. Even wells and water sources froze to such an extent that it was impossible to draw water from them. The Polish medieval chronicle also recorded this disastrous year. That year, in the midst of summer, terrible frosts and blizzards suddenly came. Many travelers and traders died from the terrible cold along the roads. Even the Roman chronicles of 1525 contain evidence of an abnormal cold snap. A terrible cold suddenly struck Rome this summer. The surrounding lands were instantly covered with snow and ice, and numerous livestock and people perished from the frost. Virtually all European medieval chronicles of 1525 note the sudden and unprecedented cold snap, the mass deaths from the cold and the subsequent sharp drop in temperature in the following years. It was from 1525 that winters became noticeably harsher. Here is what Sigismund Herberstein wrote about those events. In 1525 to 1526, the frosts were so severe that the ground cracked from the cold. The temperature was so low that even water poured into the air and saliva froze before it even touched the ground. The trees died from the harsh frost, and the next year their trunks turned black. Roads became littered with the frozen bodies of people and animals. Of course, this is just one of the versions, but it finds more and more supporters. We offer it for your consideration. And now to the next topic. Active volcanoes of Antarctica. Antarctica is considered a seismically calm continent, but even here there are volcanoes, and not only dormant, but also active. At least 2 of them have erupted in the last 200 years. The most famous of Antarctic volcanoes is Erebus. It is not only the most active in the region, but is often called the volcano guarding the way to the South Pole. The largest asteroid crater. Antarctica is home to one of the largest craters on Earth, the crater near Ulke's Land. Its diameter is about 482 kilometers. Scientists believe that it was formed hundreds of millions of years ago as a result of the fall of a giant asteroid with a diameter of at least 48 kilometers. The colossal dust ejection after the impact caused a long-term cooling, which, according to one hypothesis, led to the death of most of the flora and fauna of that period. I want to apologize in advance for any errors in the text or voiceover. I am still learning, and the channel language is not my native language. The voiceovers are done by artificial intelligence, so if you notice any inaccuracies, please let me know so I can fix them and improve the quality of the content. I'd also welcome your feedback and thoughts on the topic. Your support in the comments motivates me to keep finding new and exciting stories. Thank you for your understanding and participation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss new stories.